All right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Gary Fuqua. We're at the Nicholson Library. It's May 6th, 2019. Thank you so much for joining us today, Gary.
You're welcome.
Let's start by asking, why grapes? How did you get into wine grapes?
Well, when I was 20, I hitchhiked around Europe for 4 months and was exposed to wines, and that sort of got me interested. And then over the years, I was married in 61, and my wife and I went on our honeymoon into San Francisco and ran into people who were selling wine in Sausalito and got interested. And then I didn't think much more about it for the next 10 years. And then when I was living in Seattle working for the Army Corps of Engineers, I decided I wanted to try something in agriculture. And I thought wine grapes were probably more interesting than growing wheat or something like that.
Sure.
So I did research in 1970, went down to Roseburg, talked to Richard Sommer, looked for land and thought probably not a good idea to go down there because I needed a job, and not many jobs for economists. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in economics. So I did research. I got a copy of Winkler's book, Wagner's book. I found a copy of Charles Curry's master's thesis, and I used that as a basis for talking to him, because Chuck had a very strong personality. He didn't suffer fools. So I read his thesis before I went and talked to him. So anyway, that's how I got started. And then I found out that they were growing grapes up in the Willamette Valley. I heard about Dave Lett and Dick Erath, and I went to a meeting in February of 1971 at Jim Marsh's house, and there were 3 or 4, maybe 5 people, I don't remember all the people who were there, were talking about growing wine grapes. And then I think the next day, a couple of days after that, I ran into Bill Blosser in a real estate office in Newburgh. But anyway, when I was at the meeting with the group at Jim Marsh's house, Jim told me about this guy on Red Hills Road who wanted to sell some of his land. And so his name was Ken Carsley. And so I went and talked to him, and he agreed to sell me 35 acres for $27,500. It had 5 acres of hazelnuts and the rest blackberries. So that's how I got started. And then I ordered cuttings from Carl Wente he's down in Livermore, and planted them in my mother-in-law's backyard in St. Helens in the spring of 1971, and then went on to plant them in the vineyard in '72, in the spring of '72. At the same time, I was building a house on the property.
Sure.
So I got Vadenville clone, and I got the Gamay Beaujolais clone of Pinot Noir, which is an upright clone. I don't think anybody grows that anymore.
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you mentioned doing research. Did you have, when you got your clones and you started to plant, did you have a pretty good idea what you're doing at that point? Or
No, I had no idea.
So what were some of the trials and challenges you ran into?
Well, the first summer I had planted in '72, the grasshoppers were eating the leaves of the young vines.
And how did you deal with that?
I didn't do anything. They survived. And then the winter of '72 was very cold, and I was wondering whether they'd even survive, and they did, because it got down to 5 degrees above zero.
Who did you reach out to when you were looking for help with wine grapes?
Everybody helped each other. I talked to Curry, I talked to Erath, I talked to Dave Lett. Those are the main guys. Dave Adelsheim came a little later.
Sure.
So then the next spring, I bought plants from Dick Erath and Chuck Corey, bought the Corey clone of Pinot Noir, and I bought enough for 3 acres of Riesling. Planted 3 acres of Riesling in the spring of '73. So then planted a little more each year. And then in 1977, Dick Erath and I went to France and Germany to do some research. And we learned a lot. We had introductions from Andrei Chelychev,
Oh, yeah.
famous
Yeah.
California winemaker. And he gave us introductions at Dom Perignon and Geisenheim and in Burgundy.
Wow.
So one of the key things we learned on that trip, Dick, of course, was interested primarily in winemaking because I wasn't in the wine business per se. So I was primarily interested in the vineyards. And they were using catch wires in Germany. We'd not been exposed to that at all that I know of in the United States. I think we brought that back as a way to keep the vines growing upright.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
So that was May of 1977. Then in '78, I decided I wanted to try the wine business. So I had Sokol-Vlasser make a barrel of Chardonnay from grapes off of my vineyard. I had a 1 acre of Chardonnay, the 108 clone, which is primarily a California clone, and ripens really late. So that was my introduction to the wine business. But I decided I had a full-time job to do. I was working for, at the time, Bonneville Power Administration. So I did that for 1 year, and then I sold the wine back to them. After I bought a barrel and I bought some winemaking equipment.
Sure.
And I was making wine for fun along the way, but not commercially. So, and then during the '80s, I hooked up with Argyle, and they leased my vineyard for several years in the mid to late '80s. They did all the farm work, and because I was doing it all initially, and a full-time job and 3 kids, and too crazy.
Sure.
Commuting to Portland and back was a little more than I could stand for at the time. So I hooked up with Argyle.
Sure.
And they ran the vineyard until 1990 when phylloxera was discovered on my vineyard just behind my house. Was the first one. I think I was the beneficiary of the first phylloxera discovery.
You patient zero there.
Yeah.
So what was the reaction when that happened?
Dismay. Yeah. We knew it was going to happen. We didn't know when. You plant on own roots without rootstock, you're gonna suffer the consequences. If you, I have no idea where the phylloxera came from, but people come up from California, and if they had mud on their boots, walked in the vineyard,
Sure.
it starts. So that's when I sold part of the vineyard to Gary Andrus, Archery Summit, which is now their Red Hills estate. So in 1990 I sold, or 1993 I sold 25 acres to them, and Alan Holstein had 10, which he got through my divorce. That's another issue with the wine business and grape growing. Relationships are stressed. Anyway, and my dad bought 10 acres in '75 right next to me, so we planted his. So when I sold the 25 to Andrus and the 10 to Alan Holstein, I still had 10 left, and we started planting
Sure.
the 10 acres, and that's where we ended up. I made wine with friends starting in 1997. A group of friends got together. We call ourselves Fermenting Friends. We made wine up until 2015, and won lots of amateur awards. So, and then I discovered phylloxera on the last 10 acres I had.
Ugh.
So I started replanting that. Although I had planted on rootstock a part of it, I planted Pinot Noir 115 clone, and then I planted 3 acres of Pinot Blanc and 3 acres of Pinot Gris. Over the years, I'd also on the original property I'd planted Pinot Gris.
How did you decide what you wanted to plant and when?
Just talking to people, and who's going to buy my grapes. You talk to whoever is going to.
Sure.
And the last 10 years I sold to Erath, and he ran my vineyard.
Sure. So you mentioned, like you said, kind of starting out with some reading and some kind of talking
Right.
with people. You also took classes at UC Davis, is that?
I've taken classes at Davis, yeah.
So tell me about that kind of process and how that benefited your process.
I took both winemaking and vineyard classes, but primarily winemaking. Davis focuses on California, so most of the vineyard curriculum that they teach is primarily associated with California.
Sure.
And of course, during the early years, Oregon State started to have a program. Dr. Wang, I think was his name, at University or at Oregon State University. So in Barney Watson, at Chemeketa, and so they started with programs at the universities that focus more on growing grapes in the Northwest or Willamette Valley in any case.
Sure.
So, yeah, the Davis courses I took were primarily winemaking.
So at one point you kind of had a thought you might go into winemaking.
Yeah,
more.
again, but we made wine up until 2015.
Sure. So what was how would you describe your grape growing philosophy and how it sort of developed over the years? What were you hoping your grapes would be when they were done?
Well, I was interested in the farming aspect of it primarily, and from an economic standpoint, growing grapes that I could sell. There was only 1 year, 1984, that I had was a very cold year, and that's the only time I grew grapes that I didn't get paid for.
It's not a bad record overall.
No, over almost 40 years.
Sure.
So, no, I was growing grapes primarily from an economic standpoint, as well as making grapes good enough to make good wine. Growers don't get the notoriety that winemakers do.
Sure.
You've heard of all the winemakers.
Sure.
And you probably don't know a lot of the great growers. You may have some of I don't know who's contributed, who are just growers.
Sure. Harder to track down sometimes.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
So I sold the last of my vineyard in 2010 to a guy named David Wickman. He was at the time executive VP at United Health in Minneapolis. I've never met the guy.
Just bought your grapes.
He
vineyard.
bought the vineyard, bought the house. So I built another house. I built a house on the last 10 acres in 2002. My vineyard, it was my Italian villa. I tried to make it like an Italian stucco slate house, or
Sure.
Red roof house.
Sounds pretty amazing.
Yeah, It was. It's still there. But I drive up there every once in a while and look at it.
Sure, sure.
So,
You mentioned the kind of difference between winemakers and grape growers in terms of notoriety. How did you develop those relationships for who was going to buy your grapes and kind of make them a long-lasting, profitable relationships?
you know, in the beginning, Oregon winemakers are like one big family. I mean, they really are. You could go to anybody and ask them any question. And we had organizations, we had meetings at the Tigard Firehouse. You've probably heard about that. And I did vineyard economics and made presentations at ag shows. So there's a camaraderie that comes with the business. I don't know about it now, but with 700 wineries in Oregon.
Sure.
So anyway.
So you mentioned that you were doing pretty much all of the work in the
I was
vineyard.
doing all the work for the first 7 or 8 years.
So what was that like? What was it? How did you manage your time and effort? How did you do it all?
I worked a lot of weekends. Pruning was the hard one. Of course, I wasn't doing all the harvesting. I had crews. But pruning out there in the cold and the rain, and starting pruning in mid-December and probably finishing up in March. The first years, it's a lot of work. And you know, we started out with low-cost options. We used bean steaks from the pole beans that were no longer in existence in the valley. And so we'd buy pole beans from pole bean farmers and soak them in creosote and put them in the ground. Cheap trellis system.
I like it.
Yeah. You know, improvising wherever you can. Buying used equipment, sharing equipment. It's a lot of that.
You mentioned kind of that you got interested in, you wanted to grow something, you wanted to go back back to the earth, and you chose wine grapes.
Yeah.
Are you happy with that decision? Is that
Oh, absolutely.
Even when you're out there pruning in January, you were still happy with
Yes,
it? Happy doing
I was. I'm glad I did it all. I grew up, my folks had a big garden. My dad grew up on a farm in the Midwest, so I had some exposure to agriculture. And thought that was something, because I had a desk job. I had management job at Bonneville Power Administration, and that's a desk job, and having something to do outside. And I'm fairly adventuresome and entrepreneurial, so I thought I needed to do something other than working in a management position in the electric utility.
Sure. And so you talked about the camaraderie in the industry, and obviously you've kept some of those relationships for a long time. So tell us about tell us about the Geezers Club and some of the folks you still hang around with.
Well, the Geezers are a group of former and still growing grape growers. Vivian Weber, Jim Marsh, Dick Erath, John Davidson, and Jim McDaniel. We meet once a month for lunch and tell stories.
And you've been doing that for quite a while now.
Yeah, probably 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
And I keep in touch with the Erath.
Sure.
Yeah, in fact, there's an organization in Portland called the Good Old Boys. There are probably 45, 50 guys that get together once a month. Not all of them are in the wine business, but they're interested in wines. So I keep that. And then Fermenting Friends, my winemaker buddies, while we don't make wine anymore, we get together, probably 6-8 times a year and do wine tastings. In fact, one of our leaders is now in Europe traveling, so when he comes back on summer solstice, we'll get together again.
Excellent.
So I also have a wine storage unit at over at Willamette Wine Storage in Northwest Portland. And there's a group of people who get together every Wednesday night, drink wine, tell stories. So my life revolves a lot around the wine business.
Sure. Are there favorite stories or favorite times you like to look back on? Are there certain vintages or certain eras you're happiest to think about or proudest of?
It's great when the years like 83 and 85, the prominence of the Oregon Pinot Noir was evident. That rubs off on anybody who's in the business. In fact, I had Erath 83 Pinot Noir 2 months ago. It's still wonderful wine. Still good. And I'm sure you have collections here.
We don't get to taste them very often, though,
You don't? No, probably not.
So I'll take your word for it that it was good.
Yeah. No, it's something to be associated with. I don't know whether you call it fallout, but the association with the wine business is positive for anybody personally, I would think. So
why is that? What is it about wine that
I don't know. It's the mystique. Although growing grapes is just farming, and it's all the good and the bad that comes with farming. But it's people talk about terroir. The place of the vine is going to determine the taste of the grape and in the wine. So it's a mystery, and it goes back thousands of years, and it's unlike almost any other kind of agriculture.
Sure. Do you have an idea for what the Fuquay terroir would be described as?
Red Hills, Jory, soil, volcanic. I don't know how I describe the wines. People do describe them. They're distinctive. The Red Hills Pinot Noirs are. It's interesting, of all the white grapes that we grow, I like Pinot Blanc the best.
Really?
Yeah.
Why is that? What about it?
I think it goes with food better than any, although with the new Dijon clones of Chardonnay, the reputation of Oregon Chardonnays has come way up from the time I had Chardonnay when I had the 108 clone that barely ripened in a good year.
Sure.
Yeah, the other thing that's changed is warming. I mean, a lot more vintages are, I would call, really good, as opposed to some of the years we had some pretty bad weather conditions, and it's just distinctively warmer than it used to be. I mean, just look at today. It's early May and it's 80 and it's supposed to be 90 over the weekend.
Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah, I always had an interest in weather, and so that's the other research I did when I first came down here. I looked at weather stations like Cherry Grove, which has a history of weather data, McMinnville. There weren't any, and then I kept weather data on my vineyard. I'd take highs and lows and do degree days. So weather was always something of interest to me anyway, so that's sort of associated with agriculture.
What do you think this warming means for the future of Oregon wine?
It means you get AVAs like the new corridor,
Van Duzer?
the Van Duzer corridor. Cooler weather, more higher elevation. No one thought about planting grapes when I was planting at 1,000 feet elevation. You just didn't even consider that because you'd never get it ripe. Nowadays, 1,000 feet is not, even northern Willamette Valley is not out of the question.
Do you see, as you look into the future and look at the trend, do you see that continuing, people going higher in elevation, or do you see different varietals being planted down
I
the
think
road?
people are going to do both, different varietals. People are already planting Tempranillo up here, which is pretty unusual. I would have thought, Tempranillo, you're kidding? That's Rioja
Sure.
in Spain. And so you can plant North Slope now. You can, and ripen Pinot Noir. I don't think anybody's planting Cab. I had 2 rows of Cab on my place just for fun of it. In fact, I had a phenologic study that Oregon State gave me. There were, I think, 5 vines of about 15 different varieties.
Oh my goodness.
That's back in the 70s. They were trying to determine what would get ripe up here. Like, they even put in a Tanat, which only ripens in places like Hungary.
Did your Cab ever ripen? Did you ever get Cab to ripen?
Yeah, I did some years. I had it in a little bowl below my house.
Okay.
Yeah, if you kept the crop low in the good years, you could get it ripened. I made some Cab. It probably wasn't wonderful, but it was just enough for home use.
Sure, sure. So I want to talk about the kind of the early days of the industry, since you were there really early on. What was it like when you got into when you started meeting people and you started discovering this little kind of nook of grape growers up here? What was the industry like in the early days?
It was, again, very supportive, and it was very social. I mean, we had a lot of social events, dinners, organizational meetings, which became as much, industry associated as it was social. So, it was just a bunch of friendships.
What about customers? Were people able to find customers to buy wine?
Yeah. Well, I never had any trouble selling grapes. So,
what about people trying to sell wine?
I think it was hard initially because there's no reputation. I think nowadays there's so many wineries. I'm not sure how all of them do it. It's pretty difficult, I would think, to be one of 700 and finding a niche market. So
what were some of the were there notable like moments or changes that you noticed as you were growing grapes? Were there times when the industry felt like it was taking a giant step forward, or something notable was happening?
No, I think it was sort of cyclical, almost depending on the weather years, depending on what kind of weather you had would determine what kind of wine you could make, and then you got accolades for good years and not so much for years that were not good. And of course, you had a lot of people who hadn't much winemaking experience. You didn't have a lot of Davis graduates. You didn't have Chemeketa people graduating. You didn't have Oregon State people graduating, or
Sure.
Fresno State has a wine program too. So as the skills of the winemakers improved and the technology improved, the wine was better made. You didn't have some wines that, one wine with the name Oregon on it, which turned out to be bad, tainted the entire industry, and so you had to be careful if you got rated poorly and it reflected back on everybody else.
Sure. And the industry realized that very early on.
Yeah,
that was a problem.
I think so. Yeah.
Sure. Tell me about was there a moment at which you thought that the Oregon wine was going to be something? Because when you started, it really wasn't much of anything. It was a few people making wine. Was there a point at which you thought that it had arrived as an industry, or had arrived as a success?
After the 83 and 85 vintages, were the key vintages.
So that's when it started to get kind of a reputation?
Which is 15 years after I planted. Or not 15, but close to that.
And what happened in the aftermath of that? Like, was it national recognition,
Yeah,
international?
it was some national, some international. You know, Let's, I think it's 1975 South Block or whatever, was one of in the competition with the Burgundies, was a defining moment. And then 83 and 85, I think, were defining moments.
So we talked a little bit about the future of the industry in terms of weather, but what else do you see when you look at the future of Oregon wine? What do you see on the horizon?
So, well, it's almost, I was noting recently that the brewery industry is sort of overdeveloped, and Bridgeport's going out of business, and Widmer's closing down, and I'm wondering how all these new wineries can make it. In other words, you got to really expand the market, take care of this, although there's a lot of new money, huge money that doesn't, maybe they don't care if they make a profit or not. You know, Coppola's up here now, and the people, and Jadot, and of course Drouin's been here a long time. I think there's more vanity wineries than there used to be. People who have a lot of money are interested in wines and
Sure.
are buying wineries or starting wineries, which is different from when we started. Totally different.
Sure.
When it was a cottage industry. So.
From your specific perspective as a grape grower, especially as a farmer, especially, are there challenges you see from that part of the industry? Is there something that you worry about as you look at grape growing specifically in the future here in Oregon?
Well, with any monoculture, you have to be concerned that you know, if you take an area and completely cover it with grapevines, what are the diseases or pests that are going to give you a problem that you don't know about, that can just pop up. And of course, we always fought the bird problem. In fact, I bought a little motorbike and ran up and down rows in my motorbike to keep the birds out, because I didn't use netting. Birds are always a pest, but what's interesting nowadays is because harvests are a lot earlier than they used to be, the birds from Canada don't come down until the weather turns, so the harvest is basically over before. It used to be birds were a real problem. I don't think the last few years have been a problem at all.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you mentioned monoculture and sort of a saturation. So how does Oregon avoid that problem? Is it purely diversification of crops, or?
Some diversification, but for one thing, it doesn't, all the wine grapes are planted on hillsides, or almost all of them. And there's a lot of forest area, and there's a lot of slopes that aren't conducive to growing wine grapes. So in many ways, monoculture would be more difficult to maintain in the Dundee Hills or in the Yola Hills, or simply because of the terrain. Because all of the sites on the hills are not conducive to growing wine grapes. So there's some protection from that, from monoculture from that. Simply you can't, you're planting within fir trees and hazelnut orchards, and so you have a diverse agriculture.
Sure. So you've been around a lot of grapes and a lot of wine in your time. Do you have any particular favorites that stand out in your memory? Either favorite, you mentioned favorite vintages.
Yeah,
is there a favorite maker or favorite varietal?
I like Colleen Clemens. I like Bergstrom. I had a David Hill the other day that was really good.
Oh, interesting.
Which is the original Corey site.
Sure.
Yeah. I've had some Drouins that are very good. In fact, one year my wife and I went to Burgundy and and had a tasting in the Drouin cellar in Beaune.
Oh, awesome.
I've been to Europe, I don't know, a dozen times. Been all over the world.
It's a pretty good life, pretty good career.
Yeah, yeah. I've been to most of the wine regions of the world.
Sure. Was there a particular notable
I've been
place?
to Burgundy is simply because it's Pinot Noir. Burgundy is one of my favorites. I like Alsace too. I had the last Riesling clone I had was from Alsace rather than Germany.
Interesting.
So I like the Alsatian clone of Pinot Blanc and Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris. Anyway. Okay, you want to?
Sure. Yeah, actually, you had mentioned Charles Corey earlier, and we always like to ask people who knew him because he was such an interesting character. You talked about him not suffering fools.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about him and about your experiences with him and kind of his impact in the early days.
Well, as I said, before I even met him, because I'd heard about his reputation as being fairly direct, is that I read his master's thesis on growing grapes at the northern limits of ripening. And the first time I met him, I made that clear that I had already read his thesis. And so that was a good introduction. And then my wife and his wife got along really well. And so we have dinners up there at what is now David Hill. And I always found him charming, direct, and a real straightforward personality. And he started the first brewery in Oregon.
Yeah, you mentioned.
Then he moved to California, and then I don't know what ever happened to him. So anyway, yeah, but he's a classic. You know, where Dick Erath is a Renaissance man, Corey was just a totally different personality.
That's all the questions that I really have for you.
That's great.
Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't? Anything else you'd like to mention here?
I guess one of the things that always was interesting to me was people's backgrounds didn't seem to line up at all with agriculture. They could have been a manager in some utility like I was. Dick Erath's an electronics guy. Corey was, I don't know what he was selling something.
Selling encyclopedias, I believe, or books door to door.
Yeah, Let was selling books.
Oh, that's right. Let was one. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So all these people came from totally different backgrounds, totally different, mostly from West Coast or California, but nowadays they're coming from New York and East Coast and Minnesota. In fact, the Evanstads came from Minneapolis. When they first came out here, they rented my house.
Oh, really?
Yeah, during Pinot Noir celebrations. The first 2 years they came out, they rented my house. So I know Ken and Gracie.
That's awesome. Of course, they're big fans. We're big fans of
I know,
theirs.
obviously
So.
they donated a few bucks.
Yeah.
Anyway,
We're appreciative of that.
yeah. Anyway, so.
Well, thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much. We really appreciate this, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook there.